Cool. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for registering and logging into this webinar today. It's great to have you all in attendance. So today we're going to be talking about the greenhouse gas emissions baselining project, and this is just a bit of an introductory webinar. So just heads up, today's webinar is being recorded, so be aware of that. I believe your cameras and mics have been muted. So if you would like to communicate with us, ask any questions, please use the Q&A feature down the bottom of your screens. Just chuck a question there, then we'll get to answering it either through the presentation or it's got plenty of time at the end for questions as well. So just introducing myself, I'm Nathaniel Modra from Pinion Advisory. I work out of the Narracourt office down the southeast in livestock and cropping businesses, as well as on our family farm. We've also got Sarah Barrett here from the Freeling Pinion Advisory office. And then with us, we've also got Brad Perry, CEO of Grain Producers South Australia, and Rowan Thomas, Policy and Communications Manager. We believe Brad might be a few minutes late, but we'll continue anyway and we'll make sure he gets his spiel up soon. So just today's webinar agenda, we'll be chatting about the GPSA greenhouse gas emissions baselining project and how that ties in with GPSA sustainability roadmap and also the project overview. We'll also chat about greenhouse gas emissions and how we compare to other states and nations, and then how we go about calculating on-farm emissions and what processes we go through. The next step there obviously is how we can chat about reducing emissions and what's involved. And then the next one is so about how to actually be involved, what's the process in being involved in this project, and how do we sort of go through it and what's involved from you guys as participants. Cool. So we're on to Brad now if he's ready to go. Is your mic working, Brad?
Morning all. Hopefully you can hear me loud and clear. So Brad Perry, I'm CEO of Grain Producers SA. So I just want to run you through a little bit about the project briefly, and also where the project's feeding into. So our sustainability, draft sustainability roadmap that we've got out for consultation at the moment. So first of all, really excited about this project, so the emissions baselining project, and looking forward to having as many growers as we can on board from right across the state. So the reason why we're doing this project is because we really want to get on the front foot when it comes to sustainability. So we know that there are a lot of various stakeholders right across the supply chain that are asking for our position from a grain production point of view, where we stand. At the moment, we don't fully understand that. We don't have a consistent data set that provides that for us. So this project is about, for the first time in South Australia, trying to get a emissions baselining footprint for South Australian grain production, which is really exciting. And we expect this to actually prove what we thought has been the case for some time now, that we have a really positive story to tell in this space, and hopefully we'll be able to use this grain production baseline to provide opportunities for South Australian grain producers going forward. Should say too that thanks to the federal government and state government for their support through the Future Drought Fund, and it's been really good partnering with Pinion Advisory, who've got a lot of experience in this space. So thank you to all of those growers too who have put forward expression of interest already. We've had quite a number, so that's really good as well. I'll just briefly touch on where this is feeding into. So for a couple of years now, Grain Producers SA has had a sustainability task force where we've met with a lot of experts in this field from grain production. And what we did through that task force is we arrived at the end point of needing a plan. So a plan for the South Australian grain sector. Not a plan that overrides anything that we're doing at a national level. We certainly want to feed into what's happening at a national level, but we want to have a bit of a plan of attack on sustainability for the grain sector in South Australia. Part of that is an annual sustainability survey that we've been conducting. So I think the last one we had about 160 grain producers fill that out, and that's really providing some good unique insights that we can base some of our policy on. The emissions project that we're doing is going to feed into these. So the draft at the moment, it's a draft, the South Australian Grain Sustainability Roadmap. Encouraging everyone to have their input into that at the moment. So we worked with an experienced environmental consultant, has also worked with a lot of agriculture, particularly in the horticulture sector, Edge, and they've put together a bit of a roadmap and a plan for the South Australian sector. And some of the key things that from the feedback that they received through the process on where we need to go to ensure that we are able to quantify some of the claims that have been made in the sustainability space within South Australia. We've really taken that down to three different themes. So data collection and analysis, so establishing the baseline, then monitoring progress. So that's part of this work that we're doing with Pinion. Also around showcasing our sustainability story. So I think it's really important that we are able to tell that story, and having that evidence-based data set too will also help in pitching that story to our markets across the world and other stakeholders. And the last two parts of that sustainability roadmap is bridging the knowledge gap. So really making sure we're educating everyone involved and facilitating industry collaboration, which is really important. So just a brief summary of where the draft sustainability roadmap is at, but I'd encourage you to head on to grainproducersa.com.au and have a read of the roadmap, provide any feedback, and most importantly, the emissions baseline that we will get through the work we're hopefully doing with you as growers will feed into this roadmap. And that's all from me.
Thanks, Brad. I'm just going to pick up now and do a few slides to give you a little bit of an oversight, I guess, in terms of why you should be involved in the project, but also what's involved as a bit of a snapshot. Then we're going to start a little bit globally and look at some of the why behind this project and the subject matter that we're talking about, and then sort of dig down into that a little bit more. I'll hand back to Nathaniel and he'll take you through some more localised information and then how to be involved. Also just wanted to mention to you, as participants, there is a Q&A function in the webinar room. If you wanted to write any questions in there, please feel free to do so. And we'll also have some time for some Q&A at the end. Just a reminder again as well that the webinar is being recorded and it will be available to be viewed after this via the GPSA website. So just really quickly, a bit of an overview of why you should be involved. This is a funded opportunity. It's a free opportunity and it's available to any grain growers in South Australia. We did put a bit of a dollar value on there. We've said worth $4,000 plus. Some of that plus comes into play when you may have multiple enterprises. So we are reporting on grains, but also if you have a livestock component of your business, we'll look at that as well. So at the end of the day, you do get a report for your business on the net greenhouse gas emissions and also importantly, emissions intensity, which I'll talk about in a minute, for each of the crop types that you might be growing across your business and then also within your livestock enterprise. With that information, there's the ability there then to compare your results. So you can really start to see where you sit in terms of some of the averages that we might be expecting to see for your particular situation. And then as Brad's alluded to, the whole point of this project is to contribute to this statewide data set. The information that you'll be providing through the project will be de-identified. So while you get your own individual report, we will be collating that information into a de-identified or de-identifying the information and collating that into a statewide report as well. Let's see if we flick to the next one. Thanks, Nathaniel. We do have funding for 58 growers to participate in this project across all the grain growing regions of South Australia. We're going to be looking at data over a 3-year production period, and I'll also talk a little bit about why we're going to do that in a minute. As I said, we're going to have that aggregated data, and then we're also going to be supporting the industry along the way. So it's really it's really good and important that we're bringing the growers along the journey in this. So we are working with growers one-on-one, taking them through the process, helping them to understand the process. And so we're running 3 workshops that Nathaniel will touch on at the end of the webinar. And that's really about trying to dig down a little bit more into some of the key concepts that we're just going to give an overview of today. But those workshops will be much more involved and a little bit more content driven. So then there's also this ability, or what we're trying to do is also impart some of the learnings and explain the results of what you're getting. So in terms of the numbers that are produced with net emissions and emissions intensity, really digging down into that so that growers can understand what those results mean. Importantly too, just as the methodology that we are using the GAF, or the Greenhouse Gas Accounting Framework tools, that are the most sort of highly utilised tools that we have to calculate emissions through agricultural industries in Australia. Just onto this slide, this is a bit fun, but it's just a little bit of a snapshot really of where we sit at the moment. And my newsfeed, as I'm sure many of yours are as well, is dominated a lot by the sustainability, climate change, carbon messaging, which really is in the media a lot. And some days it feels like everybody wants to talk about it. And really this is just to show a bit of an overview of more and more we're seeing responses from companies and industry about what they want to do in this space. At the moment, I've highlighted some key ones in the media at the moment. In the top left, I think it is on your screens, we've got the new climate reporting rules. They've just passed, the legislation has passed and they now become law. So that's really about big business having some mandatory reporting around their climate risk. Also topical at the moment, GPSA are running a series of workshops and getting some feedback on these changes and to the use of paraquat and diquat. You know, we've got a lot of pressure on how we farm, and there's a lot of interest in how we do that. Then we've got in the top right-hand corner, Woolworths are going to stop selling beef linked to deforestation. That just happened quite recently in the last week or so, where there was a big push from the conservation movement around deforestation, and Woolworths responded with updating some of their targets in that area. So there's no real escape from this. As I said, there's a lot of interest in how we farm and what's happening on the farm. And we have these global and social pressures really starting to hit the farm gate. This next slide, if I can get this to go over, thanks, Nathaniel. This is just a bit of a snapshot. I won't run through all of these, but just a little bit of a snapshot of some of the big companies that are really feeling the pressure to do their bit in this climate action space, and they're really communicating how they're going to reduce emissions and keep to some of our Paris Agreement targets. So this is trying to reduce emissions to stay under that threshold of 1.5 to 2 degrees global warming. This is where it's kind of come from. We'll dig down into this a little bit more in the workshops, but just to highlight a couple of these, on a more localised level, we've got Coles. Quite recently, they've updated their targets. So 2027 target for 75% of suppliers to have emissions reduction plan. So when we're talking about 75% of the suppliers to Coles, those suppliers, you know, they might be looking for raw materials that come from on farm. And so that's really where they're going to be looking to have low emissions products to be able to meet some of the targets that they're putting in place here. Woolworths there, they also have some targets around their carbon emissions. And as I just mentioned before, they've updated their deforestation target for deforestation-free beef by 2025. Then if we switch over, just to highlight perhaps Qantas. So Qantas, or really this could be any of the major players in aviation, there's a lot of interest in using sustainable aviation fuels. In the US, the raw materials are really coming from corn, grain and oil seeds in that, and similar in those European markets. So we've got grain being grown to satisfy that market. And they've got some pretty big targets here, 10% use of sustainable aviation fuel by 2030, and they want to increase that to 60% by 2050, which is quite big. Then if I just jump into the next slide, just to bring it back sort of a bit more localised and with our industries in Australia, our agricultural industries. We've also got our industries setting some of these targets as well, and these pledges around their greenhouse gas emissions and its environmental sustainability more broadly. The red meat industry, carbon neutral 2030, CN30, is widely known. It's an aspirational target by the red meat industry. It's driving a lot of their R&D dollars, most people have heard about that. Importantly, with this target is that they want to do this without a reduction in herd size. So not to reduce the amount of production, and not to have that at the expense of the emissions reduction. The dairy industry have done some really great work in modelling climate change impacts within the dairy regions of Australia. They've found that there has been a loss of dairy farm productivity over time, and they're really drilling down into that and forward planning and future modelling what that may look like, and so how they can future-proof their industry there. Wine Australia also has a carbon neutral roadmap. They're really also seeing some impacts in the grape and wine industry in terms of some changes to things like bud burst, harvest dates, and a real compression of harvest, which is quite significant in the wine grape industry because unlike us, they don't have or not the ability to store grain in silos and that sort of thing. They've really got to use that product quite quickly after harvest. So compression of harvest signals some logistic issues for them. Then we've got National Farmers Federation. They've set an aspirational target of carbon zero by 2050. And then just to go back to our grain industry, there is a lot of work happening in the R&D space. GRDC looking at low emissions farming systems research. They've got a big project coming up with lots of research and extension activities planned around that. I might just jump into the next one. Thanks, Nathaniel. Just to give us a little bit of an overview of where agriculture sits in our national greenhouse gas inventory. I'm just going to explain some of these columns and the labelling there. So we have electricity, then going on to stationary energy, excluding electricity. We've got transport there in that darker blue. Fugitive emissions, which is really referring to our mining industry in that mustard yellow, industrial processes and product use, which is our manufacturing in that lighter mustard yellow, and then agriculture. It's roughly about just under 15% in this graph in the light yellow there. And this is a little bit old, this graph. It's 2022. It has slightly increased since then. Waste we've got in orange, and then this one at the end, which is actually delving into the negative in the green, is LULUCF, which stands for land use change, and forestry. So when I say it's digging down into the negative there, that's because it actually has a positive impact in that our land use change in that comparison is actually making more impact in improving our emissions because there's been more sequestration rather than a net negative effect. The takeaway really in this and showing this to you is that when we look at agriculture in comparison to other major areas of emissions in Australia, we're not the highest, but we're also not the lowest. So we are part of the solution here. We're kind of in the middle, but we also have like electricity. We've got more renewables coming in. So that electricity bar there is going to come down. Also transport, we've got more EV vehicles on the road. That's going to start to come down too. And as they start to come down, agriculture is really going to stand out a little bit more. So we have a part to play, but also there's a wider view that we can take here because we also have a part to play not only in this emissions space, but also we're looking after our natural resources, our water resources, our soils, our biodiversity. So there's also lots of other things happen in this space that we need to be messaging about as well. Now, just to throw up another one with greenhouse gas emissions, how we compare. So when we look at that agricultural bar that I showed before, when we break that down into where are the emissions or the sources of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions coming from, we can see that a fair chunk of this about 70% there in that darker green is coming from enteric methane. So enteric fermentation causing methane, and that's really driven by our ruminant livestock. So our sheep and beef, that's in that dark green. Also, just to explain this graph a little bit, we've got our agricultural soils there in that dark purple, about 15%. And you might be thinking, well, what's that made up of? And this is really around the chemical processes that are involved within our soils, the release of greenhouse gases through that. So there's chemical processes, soil respiration of soil microbes, nitrogen losses, decomposition of organic material in our soils, and that's really making up that one. We've also got lime in that lighter blue, and then urea as well. So liming, we've got CO2 released to the atmosphere through the breakdown and utilisation of lime, and also we've got nitrification happening with the use of some of our fertilisers. So in our grains industry, I guess you could say, well, we're playing a part. Our livestock are our major component, but we also want to look at this holistically across farm as well, which is why this is really great that we have a project like this to be able to look across the whole farm as well. Just want to jump down into calculating on-farm emissions now. And what exactly are we doing when we are calculating greenhouse gas emissions? So when we talk about looking at the emissions across farm, this is not about putting a little device or machine on your farm to measure the amount of gases that are coming out of soils or your tractors and that sort of thing. This is really around measuring what the inputs are that you're using on farm, and also what your yields are in terms of your production. And then we're able to assess and come up, use emissions factors and come up with the amount of greenhouse gas emitted. We then are able to also put in place the other side of that equation, which is the amount of carbon stored. So in the methodology that we're using with the GAF tools, we do have the ability to do that quite broadly, but we have a vegetation component, and we're able to minus any sequestration from vegetation. And that really gives us our net emissions or our carbon baseline for the farm. So this is sort of one of the first pieces of information that you've received in your report if you participate in the project. And net emissions is important because it does give you an overview of your total impact of emissions across all your farming operations. Then there's a second piece to the calculation, a second piece of data, which is on the next slide. Thanks, Nathaniel. And this one's emissions intensity. So emissions intensity is really about efficiency. It's about how much, what's the amount of, I've got CO2e there, which is carbon dioxide equivalent per unit of production that we're emitting. So how much greenhouse gas is emitted per unit of production? When we're talking about the grains industry, we're talking about this in terms of kilos of CO2 equivalent per tonne of grain. If we were looking at our livestock component, our beef and sheep, we might be expressing that as kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo of live weight. If we were looking at that in terms of our wool production, it'd be kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo of greasy wool. So that's the type of information that would be available to you in your report. Emissions intensity is really interesting because it can be used as a metric of comparison. And as I said, it's also this efficiency measure. I think particularly in the grain industry, when I say efficiency measure, it also has a measure of economic efficiency as well, because what we're doing here is we're really assessing how efficient we are in the use of our inputs to get our yield. Just on the next slide, this one is just a bit of a graphic there about our Australian grains baselines. So we do have information for our grains industry, and this work was done by CSIRO a little bit of a while back now, but it gives us an idea of what is that emissions intensity for grain production across Australia. And they came up with this figure of 315 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalent per tonne of grain. So that's our emissions intensity for grain production in Australia. Importantly, that's across the whole of Australia. It's very broad. We're encompassing lots of different climatic zones there, and it's also across all different crop types. So it's pretty rudimentary. It's a figure that we can use, and we have been using it in the marketplace, and we have been using that to compare our Australian, how efficient we are in Australia compared with our international competitors. Then if I jump into the next one, we can get a little bit more granular. So this work was done by New South Wales DPI and GRDC, and they went to all the grain growing regions across Australia, and they basically did an interview analysis and asked people, agronomists, etc., what were the typical inputs for crop types and then the yields in their region. And they came up with, we've got 5 different crop types here, and they came up with a minimum and a maximum emissions intensity range for each of those crop types. There's also a lot of variation within those regions, and importantly as well, those regions are quite broad and they also cross state boundaries. If I jump into the next slide, we're going down another level now. This work we did with Pinion last year, and we compared some emissions profiles from farms in 3 different regions. So we had Lower EP, Maitland, and we had Clare in the Mid-North. And we looked at these in terms of comparison with each other, but then also we overlaid the minimum, or the minimum and the maximum emissions intensity from that graph that I showed you before. So if you keep clicking, Nathaniel, I think that some of these will come up. Yeah, so with our wheat, we're looking like we're kind of in the middle there, but closer to the bottom end, or the minimum on that one. If we put up the barley, we're tracking a little bit higher there. So we're still under the maximum emissions intensity that we'd be expecting, but we're tracking a little bit higher. And then if we put up our legumes, okay, we've got Lower EP and Maitland there at the lower end, and that Clare's a bit of an outlier there. And then if we do the same with canola, we didn't have any canola grown on our Maitland example, but we can see that we're under in the Lower EP and then we're higher in Clare. It's probably a bit of why I've sort of picked this out too, is that we need to understand the numbers. So in this particular year, this was just a yearly snapshot of data. On that Clare property, we had a liming program occurring. So we had lime going out. That liming application has driven up those figures on the legume and the canola graph there. The important thing is that we need to understand the numbers a little bit, and also understand that that impact of liming is going to be present on that farm, on that property for the next 5 to 7 years. So while we have a high input year now, we're having the benefit of putting that lime out for years to come. We're improving soil health, we're improving plant growth, we're growing more biomass, which is a pathway for carbon sequestration in the soil. So we can't look at this in isolation. The other thing is we've got some climate and seasonal variability. And with this project, right at the start of the webinar, I talked about we're using 3 years worth of data for this project. And this is one of the reasons why, because we're trying to get a more representative view of the across years, and take out some of that climate and seasonal variability, and also these high input years which farms may have. I think the next slide, thanks Nathaniel, is just a little bit more, this is just sort of breaking down just that Maitland cropping example, just looking across that whole property there in terms of that yearly snapshot that we just had, where the emissions are coming from. So you can see there's quite a bit there in the orange with fertilizer and urea. And then we have this lighter green, which is pre-farm scope 3 I put there. This is a little bit of a teaser, because we're not going to be talking about scope in the webinar today. We will be talking about that in the workshops. But basically, just to put things into perspective a little bit, when you have a snapshot like this for your property, you're able to see where your emissions are coming from. And then you can start to say, well, there may be areas that I need to worry about, and there may be areas I don't need to worry about. Or if I start to do things like buy an electric tractor and my fuel use is only 4%, of my whole profile, I'm going to make a difference, but probably not a huge difference. So just being able to have this information is a really good tool to be able to then inform some of your decision making around where to spend your time, energy, effort, dollars, and get your best bang for buck in this space. I think that's it from me. And I was going to hand over to Nathaniel.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. Great presentation so far. And also reminding participants here that any questions you've got, be sure to chuck them in the Q&A at the bottom there and we'll get to answering them. So we can skip over them. So just talking a bit more here about what we actually need to calculate on-farm emissions. And this is just a bit of an example of our emissions input sheet, which we will be sharing with participants who are involved with this project. And this sort of just shows some of the basic information that we require. So around area that's cropped, some forestry or any trees you might have on the property. Then we'll be capturing sort of inputs in the cropping system, yields, etc. And then also livestock, if you're a livestock mixed enterprise, around opening and closing inventories and sales and purchases, etc. for the year we're talking. So that's just a quick sort of snapshot of that one. The next one here is just sort of talking about what information do we need. So obviously, as a farmer, you're collecting information all over the place and it can often be quite overwhelming when you're collecting data and what to do with it all. But this is an example of a AgWorld input summary and the actuals that we use for that season. And this sort of just shows places where we can capture some of that information of inputs of what's gone into your cropping enterprise. So with this one here, we can sort of capture fertilizer, so like the tons and litres used, etc. And then also your chemical active ingredients or litres or kilograms used. That can be really useful. This one here is just an example of the livestock inventories. This is some of the data we need to capture. So just around opening and closing numbers, which are often tied in with your tax return, your tax season, when you capture that. And then just live weight and months on farm. We're not too concerned here with valuations, etc., but mainly just, opening, closing, and then any natural increases and then purchases and sales for your business. So then moving on here, having a chat about what we can actually do on farm to reduce emissions and what can you as growers do. So here's some options around obviously decreasing the emissions that you produce while you're producing the grain that you then go on to sell. So we want to sort of be aiming to produce lower emission grain whilst maintaining and increasing production. We don't want to be just lowering emissions while we're lowering production. So sort of the biggest chunk we can take out, like Sarah mentioned, or try and reduce that emissions can be around improved fertilizer application. So making sure that we're placing that fertilizer in the right place at the right time and potentially utilising variable rate applications and section control. This can, assist in reducing emissions intensity per tonne of grain by up to 20%. So that can be quite a powerful chunk that you can sort of reduce that emissions by. The next two dot points here are just sort of some new and things we might be looking more towards the future. So around alternative input products, which have a lower greenhouse gas emissions footprint. So these sort of products are still probably in market development and potentially coming out in the short to medium future. But just around, tracking fertilizer you're buying onto the property and also things like diesel you're bringing on as well. The last one there is just around controlled traffic farming. So we can also utilise that to reduce fuel consumption, which then, that takes that fuel slice of the pie down a bit. So you're not using as much fuel. The other option here we've got is around increasing sequestration. So that's the amount of carbon dioxide or CO2 that we're pumping back down into the ground. So there's sort of some options we've got here. We can sequester carbon from existing vegetation. So, scrub paddocks you've got potentially. We can also look at replanting trees and shrubs, which can, sequester that carbon back into the soil. And then there is some methodologies around currently are sort of working on increasing soil carbon on your property as well. So that's really about, I guess, pumping carbon back into the soil. So just here again, sort of summarising where we've got to through this presentation and this webinar is just about how for you as participants and producers to get involved. So we start here obviously by filling out the expression of interest, which is via the GPSA website. So I'm sure you would have received a link potentially, and we'll probably share that with you after this webinar as well. But just, yeah, follow that link, register interest via the GPSA website. From there, you'll go into a wait list as we've got to allocate producers per certain grain growing regions and crop types. So that sort of goes through a bit of a process we have to work through. And then from there, you'll get a phone or Zoom call with a Pinion advisory consultant. From that point, then we'll work with you on how to submit your data, and we'll then review that and calculate your emissions. So that's quite important. We'll probably be back and forth with you a bit just around making sure that data is as accurate as possible. The next one there is you receive your individual report for greenhouse gas emissions. That'll be individual to your farm business. And then we'll also follow up with a phone call from a Pinion advisory consultant. So just at the bottom there, we've got these introductory workshops being held across the state in late September. And they're on 18th of September at Cummins, the 20th of September at Loxton, and the 30th of September at Watervale. So they'll be a bit more comprehensive. So this webinar is just a quick little snapshot of what sort of this project's about. But those workshops will be probably more about a 3-hour sort of workshop that goes into some of these topics in a bit more depth, which will be, quite informative. And then also be aware that participants of those workshops may be eligible for reimbursements for travel and childcare. And if you're interested in taking up that offer, get in touch with GPSA. So this just puts that into a nice infographic. So obviously the first step is submit your EOI into the portal, and then from there we'll take into consideration your geographical location and your crop type diversity. From there, we work on the data input with you. We'll also send out a privacy consent form, and there's also a survey to just make sure we're covering off on the funding and the grantees requirements. The next one there is we want to get that data back as quickly as possible. So we're sort of trying to work with about a 2-week time frame when we send them out to get that data back from you. We'll then work with you to make sure there's no gaps in the data and answer any questions you might have, and you'll get a call from a Pinion advisory consultant. From there, we'll produce your individualised farm business emissions report, and we'll go through that with you, and this will sort of represent a carbon baseline for your farm. So that could take sort of 4 to 6 weeks. And then from there, moving into next year, so 2025, we'll then be producing an aggregated and de-identified report, which is the statewide report, which will go to GPSA. And we will share those results with you via a webinar as well, so you can have a chat and understand how that sort of sits for a statewide report. That is pretty much all we have then for you guys. And thank you for your time. Do you have any questions? Be sure to chuck them in the Q&A portal and we can get to answering them ASAP.
Nathaniel, can I just ask if we have people who want to actually ask a question? I think, can they request to come off mute with you?
Yeah, request to unmute, or you could raise your hand and I can unmute you if you want to do that as well. Or you can chuck it in the webinar chat.
I might just throw to Brad. We did have one question, Brad, which was maybe for GPSA to answer. We have growers that I guess wonder why this has fallen to them. Why do they have to do this?
Good question. Well, this is certainly something that is in demand from a number of stakeholders I mentioned earlier on. So having quantified on-farm data as an industry is really important for us when we're talking to governments, we're talking to when we're looking at markets, when we're there's financiers as well that we meet with. There's a whole range of stakeholders where having on-farm quantified data on emissions is really important for us as an industry, a grain industry in South Australia. And in fact, hopefully we'll be leading the way on this. Why should you as an individual grain producer get involved in this project? Well, I think it's something that at some point in time, is going to be required, whether that is by one of those stakeholders that I mentioned, but at some point in time, and I think it's important that if you can get ahead of it, particularly when there's an opportunity for it to be done for free. So really, all you have to do is is participate in and work with Pinion on the information that's needed, and what you'll get back is a baseline for your farm, which will be benchmarked against global, national, and eventually the SA grain baseline. So some really good opportunities for you as an individual as well to understand where you sit on farm, and if there are any areas that you can improve, but also having that baseline for us, for production baseline, is critical. In when I go and sit with the government, with a minister who's asking me what the state of play is from an emissions greenhouse point of view in the grain industry in South Australia, I'm able to work through that, and I'm able to work through that from a positive point of view. One of the big examples I use as to why is I was in New Zealand when they announced, I think they were calling it a burp tax at the time, and the government put a whole heap of restrictions on and reporting on sustainability on New Zealand farmers. And quite a few of them that I talked to actually said, well, we're not that worried because we already collect this data and we already feed it into the government and other key stakeholders. We've got on the front foot with this, so we're not that worried that there will be a negative impact with this imposed. I think the sector that was worried about that was dairy, but that was a whole nother conversation. Eventually, after a couple of years, they actually scrapped that tax that they were putting on, and one of the reasons that I believe from the conversations I had was that they were able to get on the front foot and prove that they were already doing these things. So there wasn't a need as such to impose those restrictions on them. So I always think that's a really good example of my observations over in New Zealand of what happened. And whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or not, these sustainability measures are coming, and whether that's from a market focus or from other key stakeholders. And from an industry point of view, we're on your behalf, we're trying to get ahead of that and be as best prepared as we can.
Cool. Thanks, Brad. Any other questions coming through?
I was just going to say, Nathaniel, if we didn't have any other questions, something that I have been asked a bit is, are we looking at this harvest? Now, I don't know if I mentioned that, but the 3 years of data that we're looking to gather for this project is not from the harvest that is to come, but the 3 harvests previously. So from last year and then back another 2 years. So if people were wondering around that, that's that.
Yes, cool. We've just got one come through from Holly, which mentioned when we know if been selected to be involved. So you should get communication. So when you register for expression of interest, we'll then capture that and we'll inform you that you've been registered, and then we'll go through a selection process working out the locations and the crop types, and then you'll receive an email from one of our Pinion advisory consultants, and that'll be confirming that you have been selected and that we're sending out information and input sheets, etc., like that. There is a hand here. I will try. Should be allowed to talk now, Simon. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, Nathan, can you hear me there, Nathaniel?
Yep, that's good.
Well, just wondering, you attended the same thing I did with a commercial organisation the other day. What's the thinking about how this fits in with the potential for carbon sequestration and raising accus from soil changes in soil carbon levels?
Yes, great question, Simon. Yeah, this is mainly one around, I guess, understanding a baseline and where we're sort of starting as a farm business. probably not going into the depth around, I guess, ACCUs and, you know, what your potential to increase soil carbon is. It's just around a question of where's your farm business sitting currently, and the industry sort of knows where sort of our average emissions intensity is for our grain types. The next step is then to go into, you know, how viable are certain projects for your individual business, and that's sort of a different discussion probably to be had.
Okay.
Simon, I might just pick up on that as well. We get a lot of people who come in the door who really want to know how close to a carbon zero balance they are in terms of their farming operations. And the first step to understanding that is to understand what your net emissions are on farm. So I guess understanding and doing the calculations is really important in that. And it's probably a process that is a little bit missed in some of the looking into carbon credit projects. So you still really need to know this base information before you can look at those opportunities too.
Cool. Thanks for that, Simon. Any other questions, feel free to raise your hand or chuck it in the Q&A.
Nathaniel, I might just also go back to the question around finding out if you're involved in the project. Just to highlight, I guess, that we do have limited places available in the project, and we also have some parameters that we need to meet in terms of crop type and diversity across South Australia with the project. So I still really encourage people to put their EOIs in. We've been pleasantly surprised at the response so far, and we've had quite a bit of interest, which is awesome. And look, we're really going to work hard to try and get back to everybody as soon as we can, and to make those decisions about where we can get that distribution across South Australia.
And just to add to that, Sarah, for those that aren't successful in the EOI process for this project, look, we're going to have a lot of projects in this space coming up, so we'd also love to keep your name on our list for contacting for other projects that pop up under GPSA, particularly in the sustainability field. So there are other opportunities even if you aren't successful as part of the EOI.
We got a raised hand here. Let me. Oh, where to go? Did you have a question at all, Trisha?
No, sorry, I've accidentally pressed raised hand. I do have a question. Is this can I go back and watch this afterwards?
Yes, so this will be recorded, and I believe GPSA will have a link or will share something after with you around where it's located on the website or YouTube.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Any other points you wanted to raise at all, Sarah or Brad?
Not from me. All good.
No, I think we've covered it pretty well.
Beautiful. Well, thank you everyone for your time. Thank you for registering, coming along today. And yes, we'll have a recording and available for you guys, and it will be publicly available as well. A link will be sent out to you guys as participants, and also have a place on the website where it will be located. So again, thank you for your time, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.